Yeah, I'm going to be speaking kind of against mutual aid, but we'll get into more detail about that. So what is mutual aid? The term is currently applied to a wide range of activities, from guerrilla gardening to volunteering to fill potholes, from distributing socks to homeless people to fundraising for fellow activists. We can argue about what is or isn't mutual aid, but I think we're better off just distinguishing between the kinds that we politically support, those that we don't, those that we want to engage in now, and those that we would engage in if the conditions were right. So I mostly want to distinguish between two categories of mutual aid, which I'll at least initially refer to as activism and service work. Because some forms of mutual aid I think are better called activism. So what I call activism is political, or the forms of mutual aid that I consider activism are political and material support for fellow activists in struggle. Whereas service work, I would distinguish as being the apolitical provision of goods and services, aid to the masses, disconnected from struggle. So Tim Horace of the Philly Socialist has written a lot about mutual aid and what he calls base building, and he has a list of things that he calls the practical tasks of base building, which I think we should see as a mix of activism and service work. So he talks about working class sports leagues, self-defense classes, after-school tutoring, hosting block parties, dances, poetry slams, painting murals. All of those things I would consider service work at best. He also talks about worker cooperatives, research and investigative reporting, tenants unions, cop watch, neighborhood meetings, union caucuses, legal support for community members, and fighting wage theft. And those things I think we're better off considering activism. And so we do mutual aid all the time. I just prefer to call it activism. We serve pizza at meetings, or we used to, or I'm just listing, some of the random things that could be considered that we do or have done. Serve pizza at meetings, strike support, strike funds, jail and legal support for activists, raising money for the family of a police murder victim, providing financial and practical support to members of a revolutionary organization or activist group. So those are all things, yeah. So I want to limit my critique to the apolitical service work that does not directly serve struggle. Not interested in critiquing the activism, that's a different thing. So let's see. So I want to talk a little bit about strategy, the strategy of mutual aid, the lessons of mutual aid, the motivations, some positive examples, and then try to respond to the reading a little bit. So we're discussing mutual aid as a matter of revolutionary strategy, not a matter of morality or ethics. I want to say out of the gates, I agree with mutual aidists' shift in focus away from electoral politics and reformism. But instead of class struggle, they turn to another form of reformism, the idea that we can transform the world through random acts of kindness. Mutual aid tends to be functionally similar to what NGOs and church groups do, but it's passed off as something new and radical. I also want to applaud the compassion and the sense of duty to humanity that's displayed by the practitioners and the theorists of mutual aid. I would say mutual aid is generally driven by morality rather than strategy. And mutual aidists take the moral high ground, and they feel their duty is fulfilled by service work, which has no political effect. I would argue that for Leninists, compassion and duty to humanity is best expressed not by attempting to alleviate suffering, which is being continually reproduced faster than we could possibly fight it, but by eliminating what causes suffering. As class struggle activists, our goal is to take back what the ruling class steals from us. Ultimately, we don't want loaves of bread instead of crumbs even. We want to seize control of the whole bakery. Mutual aid, on the other hand, redistributes crumbs within the class. It doesn't fight to improve our lot from crumbs to loaves even, let alone seizing the whole bakery. Mutual aid attempts to replace what should be provided politically by the state, by tax and capital. And it resigns us to make do with what we already have. So mutual aid can teach some good lessons. First and foremost, that the state and the system are incapable of providing for our needs. That's an important lesson that all revolutionaries, it's at the top of our list. But it also teaches that small group action can solve our problems, that a collective society-wide solution isn't necessary or isn't possible. And it operates as if there's no need to confront the ruling class or its state, that they can be ignored instead. Mutual aid can also lead to depoliticization. It can divert energy from political struggles to win reforms. Meanwhile, one state social program, however inadequate, will do far more than any number of mutual aid efforts. So one point I want to make tonight is that the road to revolution goes through the state, not around it. We cannot avoid the state. We cannot avoid confrontation with the state. Mutual aidists seek to create alternative ways of living, carving out free space within capitalism, sometimes culminating in autonomous zones. I consider this idealist. It's trying to solve the problems of revolution without the revolution. The author of the article that, there was sort of a pro and a con mutual aid article, and the author of the con article, his name is Breslauer, and he says that mutual aid suffers from grandiose delusions, or the theory of mutual aid for social change, suffers from grandiose delusions about actually building new social relations without tearing down the existing ones. Mutual aid presents no challenge or threat to the social order. The state is indifferent or even welcoming to it, since it helps replenish and reproduce workers on an unpaid volunteer basis. Marx was critical of such schemes going back as far as 1851, where when he railed against, quote, doctrinaire experiments, exchange banks, and workers' associations that renounce the revolutionizing of the old world and seek rather to achieve salvation behind society's back in a private fashion. This is that, evasion of the problem of the state. On the other hand, I think I want to argue that we need to confront the state. As revolutionaries, we need to confront the state and the bosses. Social movement and labor organizing for reforms and gains, cadre building, organization building, these things should be our focus. The anarchist theory argues that, sorry, I'm just kind of coming in here with talking about anarchism, but I meant to, connect it to mutual aid earlier on. But the anarchist theory argues that placing demands on the state only recognizes its authority, strengthens it, and weakens the workers' movement. Revolutionary socialists, by contrast, share the anarchist opposition to the capitalist state, but think that the anarchist approach of ignoring or attempting to circumvent the state is wrong. We believe that the organized working class must engage with and make demands upon the state. So some of the motivations One, behind mutual aid, I would say break down into two categories. One being mutual aid as an end in itself, and two, mutual aid as being part of a larger project. So I would say most people engaged in mutual aid see it as an end in itself and even a moral obligation. It's clearly not enough, but I think most act as if it is. So I think we should ask, why not build what is enough instead and focus our efforts on that? And to me, the answer is class struggle and organization. Class struggle specifically strikes, protests, occupations, and uprisings, as well as the organization required for them. And then revolutionary organization, hopefully one day culminating in a revolutionary party. So the sort of better mutual aid approach, it integrates it into a political project. So it uses mutual aid as propaganda, as it's integrated with an organization to recruit to and a path to get involved in political education and activism. To be honest, this is the same approach used by the Salvation Army. It puts assistance on the end of a hook to bait it and to spread, assistance as bait on the hook of the Bible, basically. I think the dangers of this approach, which I want to talk about further, is that it can undercut our analysis. It can feel cheap and condescending, as if no one would be interested in politics, our politics and our project, without being given something. It's supposed to build broader political participation, solidarity, mobilization, radicalization. As Breslauer says in the piece that I mentioned, my contention is that mutual aid organizations do little to none of that. Solidarity doesn't come from bonds formed by sharing our meager crumbs, but it comes from coming together to take what is ours. So Breslauer shares the focus on struggle. So to discuss a couple of positive examples of mutual aid, one is the Black Panthers survival programs, which we could have multiple meetings on just that and assessing it. And another is a local campaign by Occupy Denver. I want to talk about that one first. So Occupy Denver campaigned against the Downtown Denver Business Partnership. They were which is like a local cartel of small businesses. And so they have held, I believe these are ongoing, weekly protests against the urban camping ban that targets homeless people. And these protests target businesses that are in this cartel, I prefer to call it. And they combine protests with service provision in a really brilliant way. They serve hot meals to homeless people while also picketing the storefronts of the businesses that supported this camping ban, that are in this Downtown Denver Business Partnership. Years of grueling work has been successful at driving multiple businesses, including Tatter Cover, Rock Bottom Brewery, and the Corner Bakery, to leave the Downtown Denver Business Partnership and revoke their support for the urban camping ban. No change to the legislation, though, that continues to be wielded by the police, by the city, against homeless people. And the other downside, I would say, to this campaign is that it is not really integrated into a wider political project, but it could be. So then to get back to like the Black Panthers survival programs, these provided free breakfast. Well, the most famous of them provided free breakfast for thousands of Black school children and pressured the state to expand their services. They were born out of a Maoist influenced worldview that upheld charitable work as an inherently radical act, yet stripped of the fiery rhetoric they looked suspiciously similar to liberal anti-poverty programs. Let's see. Breslauer, in his piece, says that a both-and approach isn't something he's against, but it's on us to make the service work supportive of the organization's broader thrust. If our mutual aid efforts are not closely linked with target and demand-driven fights with bosses, landlords, administrators, it has no relationship to organizing. What passes as organizing today is mostly being a member of an organization and doing whatever it takes to make that organization grow, end quote. So, you know, I think that's an important point that he makes. But I think that there's more to organizing than just activism. There's also organization building. And so we need target and demand driven activism, but it's not enough. We also need a sort of meta activism, revolutionary organization. But to get back to the Black Panthers, Tim Horace says that the survival programs were a strategy for expanding and cohering the party, improving its public image, garnering political support, and finding meaningful activity for its members to engage in. But what is the balance sheet of the survival programs? To be honest, that's an open question. It's an honest question. I don't really know. It certainly seems that they help the party achieve the goals that Horace outlines, but I would like to know more. The party ultimately succumbed to state repression, adventurism, and reformism, but why is not a simple question. And I don't know that it can be linked to the mutual aid stuff. So I guess to me, it remains an open question that I think that, you know, I feel somewhat negative about, that whether mutual aid can be used to build class consciousness, class struggle, and revolutionary organization because of the political confusion that at least potentially accompanies it. So the other article was called, the sort of more pro mutual aid article was called Communism and Climate Change, a Dual Power Approach. It claims that dual power seeks to build independent socialist institutions which exist in parallel to the currently existing capitalist state in order to serve the masses. I disagree. This leaves out the power part. There's no power in this. It says that dual power is not to compete with capitalism or reform it out of existence, but to radicalize the masses through meeting their needs, to recognize and politicize capitalist crisis as it occurs. That part I like, and to have real infrastructure in place for a revolutionary movement to self-sustain. So I would say there's no evidence that service provision leads to radicalization. By contrast, we know that engaging in struggle does. Something magic happens in self-emancipatory struggle, in making demands of power. We recognize our own power and we question dominant paradigms. I think that we should be trying to insert ourselves into social movements and labor struggles where Marxist politics are relevant, where the rubber of theory meets the road of practical fight back, where we have something to contribute and learn. Service provision doesn't offer this. It's also claimed in this piece that mutual aid or dual power is meant to provide for the, I guess mutual aid is meant to provide for the needs of the masses without an appeal to reform the currently existing capitalist state. I think, again, this is wrong. We should be fighting for reforms. We should be fighting for state provision, for state regulation, and for nationalization of industry. And then we should seize the social state and reform it under proletarian rule. Reforms are good, but the organization and the combativity needed to fight for reforms is absolutely critical to revolutionary struggle. The piece also cites Lenin, but it utilizes an anarchist definition of dual power, not a Leninist one. I prefer to use dual power as a descriptive category rather than a strategy. It's a description of a political tension that exists and conflict that exists and must be resolved when the state must fight to survive to survive overt challenges to its ability to govern that are made by workers' councils and that have the ability to execute and enforce their decisions. Real dual power means new institutions of democratic self-rule that contest the powers of the old. This piece doesn't talk anything about contestation. Ultimately, we don't want dual power. We want workers' power. Dual power is a temporary situation that we want to resolve in our favor. Let's see. The article also makes no distinction between mass service provision and service provision for activists in struggle. It claims that revolutionary socialists should prioritize permaculture and other food production strategies. This is not political work. We come together to conduct class struggle, to do political work, not to prefigure a better way to organize society. Our problems are political, not technical. We lack class power, not the technical ability to live sustainably. In fact, only power will enable us to develop and implement such technical ability. A successful proletarian revolution will inherit some terrible systems and we'll have to continue doing things in efficient ways, but we'll figure it out, provided we take power. That's the key question. And just to wrap up, this article basically dives deep into prefigurative politics, which is what I think is behind a lot of anarchist strategy and mutual aid in particular. Basically, it talks about dual power as a quote material prefiguration to a socialist society and economy that demonstrates the possibility of a revolutionary project. This is the be the change you wish to see in the world approach, where forms of struggle and organization have to prefigure the socialist society. This is act locally and only think globally. This is the end doesn't justify the means must be identical with the end. But the reality is only after the capitalist state is confronted and defeated can we begin to reorganize society and enable humans to flourish. Instead of prefigurative politics, we need strategic politics. Thanks.
Okay, so the first thing I want to do is talk about the phrase dual power, which Jason referred to, but I kind of want to talk about what that means. So that phrase was coined by Lenin, and what it referred to is the state of Russia after the February Revolution of 1917. There were basically two powers that existed. There was the provisional government of the bourgeoisie and the Soviet Workers' Council. The critical difference between the way that anarchists misuse dual power and the way that Lenin meant dual power is that in Lenin's conception, the structures were built not only to meet people's needs, but also to directly challenge the state. So anarchist conception of dual power frequently is just like, we passed out enough free breakfast and all of a sudden we don't need the state anymore. Kind of the way that Jason talked about. So the Leninist version of dual power is that we build structures that can meet people's needs, but also directly challenge the state. Okay, so now let's talk about the October Revolution of 1917 for a second. So there was a time in which the provisional government existed side by side with the Soviets, the workers' councils. This was obviously not a long-term tenable situation. So eventually, the Bolsheviks and Lenin had to directly challenge the state. And the reason that they were successful in the October Revolution is because they had the people on their side. And the reason that they had the proletariat on their side is because they realized that the provisional government was not meeting their needs, was breaking their strikes, was, smashing their belongings, their printing presses, whatever. Whereas the workers' councils were meeting their needs. So that's important to understand, like, how that dual power led to a successful revolution. Okay, so now why mutual aid? So first, what mutual aid is, the right thing to do, and I think Jason acknowledged this too. Sorry, James, I think is what I'm supposed to call you. James acknowledged this as well. But mutual aid is also necessary to build dual power. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this presentation, or this talk, I guess, since you can't see my presentation. What mutual aid is not is sufficient to challenge capitalism. So the majority of the critiques that Jason raised against mutual aid, I actually fully agree with. So I'm not here to say that mutual aid or anarchist organizations that focus on mutual aid are what we should be doing. Instead, I'm going to talk about how it can fit into a broader revolutionary struggle. Okay, so the first way that mutual aid can fit into a revolutionary struggle is it can provide service. In addition to providing services, we can combine that. It can be combined with recruitment and education. Jason said a little bit that this is kind of the Salvation Army model, and it's a little bit condescending. I think my response to that would be, in practice, even though the Salvation Army does that, there have been revolutionary socialist organizations that have been able to employ that too. And the Black Panthers, of course, is the best example. And I think that I'm going to talk a little bit about another contemporary organization that does that too, in a slightly different way. Yeah, so the Black Panthers provided free breakfast, but they also provided free political education. Secondly, and I think even more importantly, is that people don't have energy or time or the means to devote their time to class struggle or political education if they are struggling to meet those basic needs. If you are hungry, you're not going to spend your time reading Marx. You're going to spend your time trying to hustle to get money to buy food. And this leads to a lot of the harm reduction rhetoric that has led people to electoralism, and in particular, the Democratic Party. So think about, in the most recent presidential election, how much harm reduction rhetoric you've heard to justify voting for Biden. People talked about all of the horrible things that'll happen if Trump won. They'll lose their health insurance. They'll lose their food stamps. They won't be allowed to stay in the country. So people don't necessarily have the ability to think long-term when they're thinking about meeting their immediate needs. And in that situation, they frequently trust Democrats more than revolutionaries. But if revolutionary organizations can say, I can also meet your needs, then we can actually capture that energy that people put into voting for Biden and harm reduction and take that power back from the Democratic Party. Another way that mutual aid fits in is that if we demonstrate to the proletariat at large that socialist organizations are capable of meeting their needs, that can increase popular support for revolution. It also means that if we have a successful revolution, we have those structures in place, which means we don't have to scramble to build them post-revolution. So having the Soviet councils in place that were already meeting people's needs meant that when the October Revolution was successful, that there was no scramble to build those structures. And then finally, I want to talk about the rhetoric of criticism of mutual aid, and in particular, how this has impacted the Denver Communists as an organization and our revolutionary strategy. So if we can accept to some degree a both and approach, it focus on the criticism of mutual aidism rather than focusing on how we can use that to fit into our political strategy is alienating to other leftists. And we frequently get criticisms as an organization about how white we are and our white leftism. and that scoffing at mutual aid is a major part of why we get that criticism. And now I want to talk a little bit about Black Hammer, which is a cult. Ghazi is a trash person. And what has happened recently with Black Hammer is something that I think we all saw coming. So for those who don't know, Black Hammer recently had a couple members quit and kind of like publicly publish with Black Hammer's official email account some criticisms of the organization. But I think what's really telling about those criticisms is when those folks have talked about why they joined Black Hammer in the first place. So the reason they joined Black Hammer in the first place is because they saw them providing for their community and they wanted to get in on that. So Black Hammer is a relatively new organization that has grown extremely quickly and has chapters all over the country and even some in other parts of the world. Not to say we should replicate what they're doing in any way, but people are drawn to that revolutionary socialism combined with an ability to immediately meet people's needs. So by scoffing at what they're doing, we are alienating people who otherwise might join our organization or at least work with us. And that's really harming our ability to build a broader working class movement. And that's the end of my presentation.